Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Brittnee. So it is still super hot in here and sadly the AC has been delayed for a couple more days. So I won't be demonstrating today using any chocolate, but I will be walking you through my full chocolate molding process. In most of my decoration or recipe videos, I focus on the one specific thing that I'm showing you guys in that video, and I don't always cover each little thing that I do routinely when I'm making chocolates. So I thought that this would be a helpful video to make. That way, if you ever have a question about the specifics or the order of things, you can pop over to this video and do a little review. I've organized the chocolate molding process into steps. And in my process, I have 9. And I actually think that I'll break this topic up into 2 parts. I hope that's not too annoying because as I was listing everything out, I realized it is a lot of information. And I also decided that I wanted to create a PDF workflow that is like a visual representation of each step, along with key points to remember at each step. So I'm going to work on making that nice, and it'll be available with the next video, which will be part 2. So let's jump right into the first 4 steps. Step 1 is prepare your working environment. So the main 2 things that I've put into this category are temperature and humidity. They're probably the most important, you could say, I guess. So temperature range. For your room temperature, you want between 68 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That is 20 to 21 degrees Celsius. I would say the max temperature you could get away with, but it isn't ideal, is 72 degrees Fahrenheit. It feels pretty hot when you're working with chocolate, and that is 22 degrees Celsius. For humidity, the general rule is below 50%. So if you can't work with chocolate in these conditions, you're going to make things a lot harder on yourself. And this is why I'm not filming any chocolate demonstrations for the last month, because it is 79 degrees in here, which is just too hot for chocolate work. I'm not even going to try. And humidity is 45% in here right now, which is fine. But once I get AC in here, that will also help decrease the humidity levels, which will be great. Just a couple other things I want to mention within this step is counter space. The more counter space you can clear off in your kitchen, the easier it'll be, because it's nice to have the flexibility to move around and not be stuck in one spot. It also depends on how many chocolates you're planning to make, but even just with one mold, like a full island cleared off in a regular sized kitchen is like ideal for me. Another thing that I'm always aware of is whether or not there's direct sunlight coming in from a window. In my apartment here, I have big windows right here on the side, but when I'm making chocolate, I always make sure to close the blinds, because even though you can look at your thermometer and the temperature says it's 69 degrees, if you set your molds over in the direct sunlight without thinking about it, it's going to be a lot hotter in that specific spot. So just something to think about. And the last thing I want to mention in your working environment is that you should also just always be aware of where your sink is at. Just because if you have chocolate molds or like open cocoa butters or a bowl of tempered chocolate sitting near your sink and you're not thinking about it, and then you're like washing a dish or something and you splash water into those things, it could take your chocolate or cocoa butter out of temper or cause it to bloom and mess with your final result. Step 2 is prepare your chocolate molds. So you'll first choose your mold. That means what kind are you using? I would highly recommend using any polycarbonate mold or the hard plastic kind, like this. And of course, what shape you're in the mood for and how many you'll need. If my molds seem dirty, I'm going to clean them with hot water, soap, and a soft cloth, like a microfiber towel. I have a YouTube short demonstrating this that I'll link in the card and in the description below if you're curious. Now, before you can work with your mold, you need to also make sure that it's dry. You can either like wash it in advance and let it sit out and air dry, or you can take an airbrush with just air and blow out all the water from the cavities. Blowing all the water out of the cavities yourself also can prevent getting water spots as the water dries out on its own. And the last thing you want to do before you actually get into the chocolate molding process is to make sure that your mold is polished. And you can do that a couple ways. You can polish it dry using either cotton balls or a microfiber towel. If you can still see like leftover cocoa butter or something, or you have water spots, if you want to, you can use this 200 proof food grade ethanol. I have some here and I will link the exact brand I use. I made sure that this is food grade. Yeah, if you do, make sure you buy the right kind so that it's safe to use on your molds. And the last thing here is about the temperature of your mold. I have gotten people asking questions of whether or not they should either heat up their mold before they mold chocolates or put it in the fridge before they mold chocolates. And the answer to both is no. You don't need to do either. You can use it at room temperature because your room temperature should be between 68 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a great temperature also for your mold. No reason to heat up the mold before you put chocolate in it, and there's also no reason to cool it down before you put chocolate in it. Before adding chocolate to the mold, you don't want to introduce any sort of condensation or abrupt temperature change in your chocolate because you don't want to shock or damage the chocolate in any way. Step 3 is decorate your mold. This is maybe my favorite step. It's kind of the funnest part. So you have pretty much endless options for decorating your chocolate mold. You can go the natural route and don't add anything to it. Just use natural chocolates like dark milk, white, ruby, caramel, and just have the natural chocolate colors be the design. You can marble natural colors together, which can look really cool. You can add some luster dust by flicking or painting it into the mold, or you can use colored cocoa butter to make all sorts of colorful designs. So the details on how exactly you'll apply the design to the mold will be different for every design. But for this video, I'll give you my recommendations to keep in mind for when you are working with cocoa butter. The first step will always be to temper your cocoa butter. You can either color your own or you can use pre-colored cocoa butters. I would say that like 90% of the time I use pre-colored cocoa butters from either Chef Rubber, like this one, or Pastry Chef's Boutique. You can check out the videos that I've linked in the description to learn how to color your own and also temper cocoa butter. So some of the things that I do with my cocoa butter will change depending on whether I'm using it for hand painting or airbrushing. So first I'll talk about my tips for when you're applying the cocoa butter by hand. So the first thing that you might wonder is what temperature do I work with it at? After I heat it up and then cool it down to 27, and then I bring it up between 28 and 30 degrees Celsius. But really the exact temperature depends on the design. Some designs will work better with thinner cocoa butter, which means it's a little bit warmer, and some designs will work better with a bit thicker, which means it's a little bit cooler, all within that range. If it's too thin, it can be hard to get a nice coat, but if it's too thick, it could leave too thick of a coat, of course. You'll also find that some colors are just naturally thicker or thinner than others. Some colors can seem really pretty thin at 29 degrees and some can be like pretty thick at that same exact temperature. I've found that if I am doing like detail work, like a black outline or like drawing, but really painting something into the mold, I like to use a cooler cocoa butter because when it's cooler, it's a little bit thicker. I've also discovered that cooler, thicker cocoa butter works better against the static electricity that you'll sometimes get in a polycarbonate mold. For example, last Christmas when I was doing like these cute little snowmen with black eyes, dot eyes, and little dots for their smile, as the paintbrush would get close to the mold, right before I tapped it onto the surface to do my design, the edges of the mold would pull cocoa butter off like a magnet. And usually you have a bigger problem with that when your cocoa butter is warmer, which makes it thinner. So it can resist the electricity if it's a little bit cooler. And depending on how thick you want it, sometimes you can just start using it as it's cooling even below 27 degrees. Just know that like you should be finishing up your design and not like rewarming it past that temperature, because you might also take it out of temperature once it gets too cool and then you're trying to warm it back up again. Also, don't forget that you can keep your cocoa butter within working temperature by carefully running over it with your heat gun. Now, I know some of you have wondered and asked me what my workflow is when I'm working with multiple colors of cocoa butter. And the answer is really different depending on what kind of design and how many molds I'm doing. So for example, if I'm doing like one mold that has 3 colors in the design, one mold, depending on the design, if it's like a pretty simple design where I'm just like sponging it on or brushing with a paintbrush, I can apply the color pretty quick. So I'll probably just temper all 3 cocoa butter colors at the exact same time, and then they're all ready to use at the same time, and I can quickly apply each color one after the next before any of them go out of temper. If I'm doing a more intricate hand-painted design that'll be more time consuming, I'll probably just temper that color that I need first, finish doing the hard part, and then doing any other colors that are quicker after that. So it's just a matter of managing my own time by predicting how long each design element and application will take me. If I'm doing a whole like box design with like a series of 9 for like Christmas or something, I will actually draw out each design and write out each of the steps needed, including all the colors and what design I'll be putting onto what mold. And then I'll write down what order they have to be applied in. So then I'll temper each cocoa butter color one at a time. And then I'll apply that one color everywhere it needs to be on all the molds where I can. Then I move on to the next color and basically do the same thing. So I'm trying to minimize the amount of times I'm tempering any one given color, if that makes sense, just for efficiency. Of course, there are times where you have to temper the same color of cocoa butter more than once, and that's just how it goes. Now, I have wasted money thinking that I can just temper everything at the beginning and then hold them at working temperature, but it never works for me. I bought a super expensive cocoa butter warming cabinet from Chef Rubber that actually gets way too hot. And so I never use it. It's also really huge and I really don't have anywhere to put it. I also bought a heat plate to set my cocoa butters on to keep them warm. But the way a heat plate works is that it warms up, like it heats up and then it gets too hot and then it turns off and then it cools too cool. So pretty much like it's not actually keeping my cocoa butters in the correct range, and if they're just going to go out of temper anyway, trying to keep them in temper, like why bother? So I've given up on all that and I just try to be efficient in my workflow on when I'm tempering different colors in my design, and so far it's worked pretty well. I'd rather not waste my mental and physical energy playing the temperature game, you know? Yeah, so I've realized I enjoy myself a lot more when I keep things simple and organized. And for me, that means tempering less cocoa butters at a time and just focusing on one task. The more I try to multitask, the more mistakes I make, and the more mistakes I make, the more time I end up wasting in the end anyway. So one technique I would say that I use most often when I'm decorating molds is that I'll temper my first cocoa butter color. So heat it up, cool it down, and as it's getting close to hitting the low temperature, I'll heat up my second color so that by the time my first color is hitting that low temperature of 27, my second color is now melted and cooling down. While that one's cooling down, I'll apply the first color to the mold. By the time I'm done doing that, the next color will probably almost be cooled down, and then I just like repeat that with as many colors as I need. One thing to remember is that in between decorating and managing, the one thing you do have to do is like keep checking on your cocoa butter. Always be checking the temperature so that you're watching it as it drops, and also stirring it. So I'll usually like set my cocoa butter next to the mold I'm decorating, and I'll stir it in between every couple of cavities that I'm decorating. One last thing that you'll want to think about as you're deciding like how long it'll take to temper different cocoa butters and like managing your time is that it will take a lot longer to temper a container that's this full versus this full, right? So if this is like your second or third color, don't even bother tempering it until right when you need it, because it's so quick to temper. It's quick to heat up and it's quick to cool down, just because there's so little in it. But one like this can actually take quite a while to cool down, and you don't want to just stand there stirring it. Like, this is definitely one you want to multitask with. So that's just something I always consider as well as I'm working. Okay, so those are all my thoughts on cocoa butter and hand painted designs. So now let's talk about airbrushing. When I airbrush, I usually use almost the exact same process every single time. First, I temper the cocoa butter, and I always just do one at a time. When you're airbrushing, there's always a lot going on anyway. Like, the last thing I want to deal with is managing more cocoa butters. So what I'll do first is heat up, melt my first cocoa butter color, and then I'll actually set this one aside and set up all my airbrush equipment. So I'll grab my spray booth and a new filter for it. I'll get that set up with parchment paper underneath so that I don't like get cocoa butter all over my counter. And then I'll get out my compressor, turn it on, hook it to the airbrush, and while that's filling up, you know, I'm still stirring my warm cocoa butter as it's cooling down. The next thing I'll do is take my heat gun and warm the airbrush up completely. So like, basically I'm taking just this connected to the compressor and I'm warming up everything inside of like the metal part. And then once my compressor is full, I turn the airflow all the way open and the paint flow all the way open. And I just spray this till I get a clean paper towel, just to make sure any leftover cocoa butter from last time is fully cleaned out and it's not going to mix with my new color. And just another little note, if you're wondering, lately I've really just only been using 80 PSI. Anything lower than that will give you, like, if you're wanting to do like splatters or something, the lower pressure isn't pushing the paint out as much. You can check out like way more detailed airbrush video, and I like test out all sorts of different settings, and I'll link it in this card and also down in the description. So yeah, I keep my PSI at 80 and then mostly just adjust the airflow on the knob here and then the paint flow here. And pretty much once I get everything set up and ready to go, I check on my cocoa butter. It's probably pretty close to being cooled down to the low temperature, and then I'm just going to warm it up, and I always warm it up to 31 degrees Celsius. The reason why is because you want it to be thinner and more fluid, and that will help it come out of the airbrush better. So that's something I always do when I'm airbrushing that I don't do when I'm hand painting, is I warm it up like all the way to 31. And I do that because it's more fluid at higher temperatures, and also it will help prevent getting clogged as easy, because as you spray the airbrush, it cools down the cocoa butter as it's coming out. Oh, and just be careful not to get it above 32 degrees Celsius. So when you're warming it up to 31, just be really careful, like keep checking it and stirring it. And yeah, because above 32 Celsius could go out of temper, and you don't want that. Next, I grab a sieve, and nowadays I just always pour my cocoa butter through the sieve as I pour it into my plastic cup, because I've dealt with just like, you know, when you're cooling down your cocoa butter, there can be like unmelted bits on the edge of the container sometimes, and sometimes they can fall down into the main like pool. And when you put it through your airbrush, it can clog it, and it's just really frustrating when you have to deal with a clog. I've just decided, like, what am I doing? It is not worth it. Always put it through the sieve as it goes into the cup. Also, I pretty much always use the plastic cup these days because it's nice and big. In fact, I need to order like 5 more, because it would be nice to not have to do a thorough cleaning in between each color, which is what I currently do because I only have one of these. And then, yeah, I like it because it's bigger than the metal one I have. But I also like plastic because the plastic will retain heat, which means it keeps your cocoa butter warmer for longer. And like I said, when you're airbrushing, the cocoa butter will cool down as it sprays. So you kind of want it to stay at that like higher temperature of 31 degrees as you're working. And yeah, so that's what the plastic does. So yeah, once I fill the cup up with cocoa butter, I fill it up obviously on the airbrush. Otherwise it would come out the bottom, right? I got the lid on nice and secure. I'm not gonna put it on. It's all connected. What I do is always, right before I used it, now I've heated up the whole airbrush to clean it out when I sprayed it on the paper towel, right? To make sure there was no leftover cocoa butter in. The metal on this will cool down pretty quick. And you know, once things cool down, it makes the cocoa butter set up. So before I spray, every time I take my heat gun again and I kind of just like point it at the metal part like this on both sides. And there's no way to measure this. So you're just kind of like eyeballing it and you'll get used to it with practice, but yeah. So I'm running up and down the airbrush like this and I'm spraying like the tip to make sure, you know, all the extra cocoa butter that might be sitting in there is warm. And then before I spray anything into my mold, I spray onto either a paper towel or a piece of parchment paper for two reasons. The first reason is simply to test out the airflow and the paint flow to make sure like I'm getting the thickness that I'm wanting or the pattern. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is that heat guns are really hot. Like, they're really hot if you've used one before, which means it's getting the metal super hot, which means it's getting the cocoa butter that's left in here pretty hot too, probably taking it above 32 degrees and taking it out of temper. So before spraying in the mold, I'm also spraying it on the parchment paper to get any like untempered cocoa butter that like I untempered in here off, out of the way. So then it's pulling like the tempered cocoa butter through. Okay, so that's just something I always do and it's always worked for me so far. So I think that's a good thing to do because yeah, like I said, you can't really measure, like you have to heat this up as you're working with it to keep the cocoa butter warm and fluid, but you can't like actually measure how hot you're getting it once it's in here, you know, with a thermometer. So I think it's good to just always like clear it out before spraying anything onto your mold in case you got it too warm. So then the same goes for as you're working. I usually like spray one coat on the full mold, maybe two coats on the full mold, clean off the mold in between coats, either on a clean paper towel or with a scraper to get off all the excess cocoa butter on the surface. And then I will do the same thing, like reheat up the airbrush, make sure things are staying warm. And then also sometimes I'll just like go around the plastic cup to make sure like the environment is warm and just everything's like staying in working temperature. So that's just kind of what I do. This is kind of one of those things, like you want to be exact with chocolate, but with this, like it's hard to measure when you're working with the airbrush. You kind of just have to get a feel for it. Like if you only did like 2 pass-bys with a heat gun and things are clogging up, next time you'll know like, oh, it must be getting too cold in there, you know? So, okay, once I'm done spraying my mold with my first color, I'm just gonna dump the extra back into the container, and then I'll grab my second color, heat it up, set it aside. As it's cooling down, I'm going to basically take off the cup, wipe it completely down really good, using my heat gun to melt any of the cocoa butter on here and then wiping it all off with a paper towel. If I'm doing all this in one day in between colors, I never wash with water because it's really hard to dry the pieces. So I'm only going to like clean everything with a paper towel. For the airbrush itself, I'm basically just going to do the same thing I did before I started using it, which is get it really, really warm, like heat it up completely, make sure all the cocoa butter is fluid, and just spray it on the highest airflow and 80 psi until it comes out clean. And then it's basically just ready to use again. So, and then I just repeat this in between each color. When I'm done completely for the day, I will wash the plastic cup and all the attachments, not the airbrush itself, with hot water and soap. Okay, I just knew the cocoa butter step was going to be long-winded, so sorry about that, but I hope it was useful and helpful information for you guys. Oh, the last thing too, I mentioned this with the airbrushing, but the last step when decorating the mold is to make sure your mold surface is completely clean. Even when you're hand painting or anything, you can do that when the cocoa butter is still fluid by wiping it on a paper towel, or you can actually use a scraper. Just be careful not to scrape any dry cocoa butter back into the mold. It works best not when the cocoa butter is fluid and not when it's set up, but when it's in that like pasty in-between texture. That's when using the scraper works best, because it will like clump together and not fall in or drip in. Also, some of you have asked, how long after decorating the mold with cocoa butter can you put the next cocoa butter color in, or start molding your chocolates with tempered chocolate? And the answer is pretty much right away, because your cocoa butter decorations should be thin because you want them to be thin. You don't want like a really thick cocoa butter coating on your chocolate. It should set up really fast. Basically, if you start up here, by the time you decorate all of these cavities and get to this one and grab your next cocoa butter color, this one should be set up and ready to apply the next part of the design. And by the time you decorate a full mold, clean up your cocoa butters, temper your chocolate, your mold full of beautiful cocoa butter decorations are also ready to jump right to the next step. So there's no certain time that you need to wait. But also, if you do happen to want to wait and prepare a bunch of molds and decorations in advance, you can do that too. So you can actually store decorated molds for quite a long time before shelling. I'm not going to give a specific time frame because I'm not sure, but you can decorate them pretty far in advance. The most important part is actually like how you store them. That will determine like how good they come out 2 months or 3 months later. The longest I've gone is like a month probably. I think it was like 3 weeks I decorated them in advance, and I just kept them like stacked together sideways on my kitchen counter, and they were totally fine, but I kept my room temperature at the appropriate temperature range. So if you're trying to decorate in advance and store them, I would recommend, to protect them from like physical contaminants like dust or something falling into the molds, I would probably either stack them tight up against each other like this, so that it's protecting the cavities, or wrap each of them in plastic. And then you just want to store them in low humidity and like a cool, like a cool dry place, like a pantry. Basically the same temperatures and humidity levels as working with chocolate. But for sure, one thing I want to say is don't put them in the fridge. You do not need to refrigerate them. You do not need to even put them in a wine cooler at a warmer temperature. They're good at room temperature because you don't want the cocoa butter to contract at all from the mold. If the cocoa butter contracts too early from the mold, it can cause cracking, along with wherever the cocoa butter comes out of contact with the mold. And then when you add like warm chocolate into the cocoa butter, it will press back against the mold. You're going to have marks on the outside of your chocolate that will be like not shiny or really dull looking. All right, I think we've covered everything that I can think of with decorations. And step 4 is temper your chocolate. I'm including this as its own step because some people might not even know that you need to temper chocolate at all, or what that even is. And this is a step that you will repeat more than once. And if you really get into making chocolates, you will do this a lot. So the first thing to mention is what type of chocolate you want to use. You do not want to use chocolate chips, candy coating or candy melts, even compound chocolate. Those types of chocolates, or baking chocolate. I've gotten asked that. You don't need to temper those types of chocolates. In fact, you can't temper those types of chocolates because they don't even contain what you need to temper, which is cocoa butter. Anyway, if you want a deeper lesson on the different kinds of chocolate, check out this video. I'll also link it down below. So the type of chocolate that you do need to temper and that you want to use for molding chocolates is called couverture. Basically, it contains a high percentage of cocoa butter, which is the fat in chocolate. And you can tell it's couverture if you check the ingredients and you don't see oils like palm oil or vegetable oil. And really the only ingredients you should see are sugar, milk, cocoa mass, and cocoa butter. And to temper chocolate, you have a couple different options. You can use cocoa butter silk or my cryo. You can use the tabling method, or you can use the seeding method. There are some other methods as well, but those are my top methods. I have a pretty popular video on my channel that is teaching people how to use the microwave method for tempering chocolate, which is great. And I use that in a pinch or when I'm tempering like small quantities of chocolate. Really, the microwave method is just a modified version of the seeding method. That's why and how it works, but it isn't very precise. So I don't recommend it when doing molded chocolates unless you're like in a hurry or just doing one mold. I just wouldn't rely on it because there's nothing about it that you measure, at least the way that I do it. So I just prefer the seeding method. It's the method that I use the most and it's proven to be really reliable. So when I'm doing the seeding method for tempering my chocolate, I will either use my warming tank or a microwave safe plastic or polypropylene bowl. When I'm just making like 1 to 3 molds, I probably will just temper the chocolate in the bowl. If I'm doing like 4 or more molds, I'll use my warming tank. Tempering in the bowl is a lot quicker, where the warming tank takes a bit of time to warm up, but it really is great when you're doing like a bunch of molds at a time. And you also might be wondering, like for one mold, how much chocolate to temper. I don't really have exact amounts for you. When I'm making like 1 to 3 molds, I usually do like 2 pounds of chocolate in my bowl. If I'm doing more than 3 molds, I'll like fill my tempering tank up. So like, I don't know how many pounds it holds. I can't remember exactly, but I think it's around like 5 or 6 pounds. So basically what you want to make sure is that you're tempering more chocolate than you'll use and more chocolate than you'll need to finish the task that you're doing. Because of course it's super frustrating and a huge hassle if you run out of chocolate in the middle of a project or before finishing like the task that you're working on. So if ever you're questioning how much to temper, do more than you think. And with practice, you'll learn like how much is enough for a given project. Usually I have tons of extra, which is totally fine because you can always pour it on a parchment, let it set up and reuse it again, retemper it for the next thing that you do. All right, guys, that is where we'll stop for today's video. I hope that you've enjoyed learning some of the specific things that I do when molding chocolates. Be sure to check out part 2 next week, and that will include steps 5 through 9. And please show your support for this video by giving it a like and leaving me a comment down below. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, today's the day. If you'd like to see something else that's sweet, just click on one of these thumbnails. Thanks so much for watching today, and I'll see you soon. Bye!